The dust had not yet settled on Tobias Archer's boots when Josephine Alden stepped off the stagecoach and told him, without a moment's hesitation, that what he had built was a home, and he stood there in the afternoon heat of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the year 1882, completely undone by 3 quiet words from a woman he had never before seen in his life. He had lived 40 years on this earth, and not one of those years had offered him the vocabulary for what he had constructed out of raw timber and stubbornness, and the particular kind of silence that settles on a man when he decides the world owes him nothing. He had come to this territory in 1861, barely 20 years old, with a mule named Patterson and a seed catalog. He had read so many times the pages had gone soft as cloth. He had driven fence posts into ground that resisted him, had coaxed water from a creek that ran thin in the summer months, had negotiated with the land itself the way a patient man negotiates with a difficult partner, slowly, respectfully, without demanding too much at once. He had planted cotton and then switched to cattle when the soil told him cotton was not its calling. He had built a barn before he built a house, which his neighbor Earl Whitfield had found amusing and his neighbor's wife Clara had found alarming. He had built the house next, a proper structure with 2 stories and a porch that wrapped around the front and one side, with windows that faced the creek so that the morning light came in gold and soft and reminded him, on the good days, that the world was not entirely made of difficulty. He had hired men and let them go. He had learned to read weather by the smell of the air and the behavior of his cattle. He had attended church in Redemption Creek on Sundays, not because he felt called by God in any particular way, but because the town needed to see him, and he needed to remember that the 40 miles between his property and the nearest large city were not an excuse to forget that civilization existed. He had watched other men marry and watched other men fail at it and watched a few succeed, and he had decided somewhere around his 30th year that marriage was a particular kind of courage he had not yet located in himself. He had not stopped looking, exactly. He had simply stopped expecting to find it. The Archer Ranch covered 600 acres by 1882, and it ran lean and well, the way a good operation should. He employed 3 permanent hands, Miguel Vargas, who had been with him 12 years and could rope a steer one-handed from horseback, Declan Prout, a young man of 23 from Georgia who was still learning but learning fast, and old Pete Chambers, who was neither as old as his name suggested nor as limited as his age sometimes made him appear. They were his daily company, these 3 men, and they ate together at the long table in his kitchen, and they argued about cattle prices and weather and which of the 2 saloons in Redemption Creek served the better whiskey, and Tobias participated in all of these arguments and felt, most evenings, that this was a good enough life. But there was a quality to the evenings, particularly to the hour after supper when the men drifted to the bunkhouse, and Tobias sat alone on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, that he could not name. It was not loneliness, exactly, because he had known loneliness when he first came to this land, and this was different. Loneliness was an absence. This was something more like a room with all its furniture in place, waiting for someone to actually live in it. He had everything arranged correctly. He simply did not know what the arrangement was meant to be called, or why it felt incomplete despite being, by any reasonable measure, complete. He was sitting with this feeling on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in late April when Earl Whitfield rode up fast with a look on his face that meant news, and Earl never came with small news, only the kind that rearranged things. "Stagecoach came in," Earl announced, pulling his horse to a stop in a cloud of red dust. "Woman on it asking for directions to your place." Tobias set down his coffee cup. "What kind of woman?" "The kind who has a trunk and a letter and a look that says she intends to be somewhere and is not interested in being redirected." Tobias frowned. He had written to the agency in San Antonio 3 months ago, at Clara Whitfield's persistent urging, about the possibility of, and he had used these exact words in the letter, a woman of practical disposition who might be willing to consider a partnership arrangement in a working ranch environment. He had almost immediately regretted sending the letter, had spent 6 weeks convincing himself no one would respond, and had then received a politely formal reply from a woman named Josephine Alden who lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, and who had written 2 pages about herself in the most direct and unadorned prose he had ever read from anyone, man or woman. She had written that she was 32 years old, that she had been a schoolteacher for 9 years, that she had nursed her mother through a long illness and her father through a shorter but more devastating one, that she had no remaining family in Cincinnati and no particular attachment to the city, that she found the idea of the Western Territories interesting rather than frightening, and that she was not looking for sentiment but for something real. She had used the word real 3 times in the letter, each time with a different weight, and Tobias had read the letter 4 times in one evening, which he had not done with anything since that seed catalog in 1861. He had written back. She had written back. They had exchanged 6 letters over 3 months, and each letter had been careful and honest and had revealed, gradually and without drama, 2 people who were both more complicated and more straightforward than the lives they had each been living might suggest. He had not been entirely certain she would come. He rode into Redemption Creek at a pace that was faster than he would have liked to admit and arrived at the stage station, to find her standing beside a trunk the size of a small cabinet, in a dress the color of dark honey, with a hat that had traveled somewhat poorly, and a composure that had not traveled poorly at all. She was of medium height, with brown hair pinned up practically and eyes the particular shade of gray-green that changes with the light, and she was looking at the street of Redemption Creek with the expression of a woman cataloging what she sees rather than reacting to it. He dismounted. He was aware that he had not combed his hair. "Miss Alden," he said. She turned to look at him, and he saw the assessment happen behind her eyes, thorough, unhurried, and remarkably without judgment. "Mr. Archer," she said. Her voice was steady and carried a warmth that her face kept in reserve, the way some people save the best of themselves for speaking rather than expression. "How was the journey?" "Long," she said. "Kansas is flatter than I expected. Texas is redder." "It is," he agreed. "Both things." There was a pause, and it was not an uncomfortable pause which surprised him. He had expected the first silence between them to be awkward, filled with the particular strain of 2 strangers trying to figure out what they are to each other. Instead, it was more like the pause between 2 people who have already exchanged enough words in letters that the silence feels earned. "I can take the trunk in the wagon," he said. "I brought the wagon. I thought a trunk." "That was sensible," she said, and the warmth in her voice tilted slightly toward amusement. "I appreciate the thought." He loaded the trunk with help from the station boy, who was 14 and clearly fascinated by Josephine, in the way that boys that age are fascinated by composed women of quality. Tobias gave the boy a nickel and felt, for a reason he could not immediately identify, that he should be more composed himself. They drove out of Redemption Creek toward the ranch in the long light of late afternoon, the road running red through the scrub and the low hills, and Josephine Alden sat beside him on the wagon bench and looked at the land with those cataloging eyes, and did not fill the silence with anxious conversation, which was something he appreciated more than he could easily say. "Tell me what it is," she said after they had ridden perhaps 2 miles. He glanced at her. What is?" "The thing you built." She gestured, a small sweep of her hand that took in the general direction of the land ahead. "In your letters you described the acreage and the cattle numbers and the water situation, but you never described what it feels like. I want to know what it feels like before I see it." He considered the question seriously, as she had always demanded in her letters. She had a way of asking things that made clear she wanted a real answer, not a performing one. "It feels like something I started and kept adding to without always knowing what I was adding toward," he said at last. "Like a man who begins a sentence and discovers the meaning of it while he is speaking." She was quiet for a moment. "That is the most honest description of building something that I have ever heard," she said. They rounded the last curve in the road, and the Archer Ranch came into view in the golden evening light. The house with its wraparound porch, the big red barn, the fencing running straight and clean across the land, the creek catching the last sun in a line of silver, the whole thing sitting there in the quiet authority of something that has been properly made and properly kept. Josephine Alden looked at it for a long moment, and then she said simply, quietly, with the certainty of a woman who names things correctly, "That is a home." Tobias Archer felt something shift in his chest, the way ground shifts when a key stone is finally laid. He had spent 40 years building something he could not name. She had named it in 3 seconds. He did not say anything immediately, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish the moment, and he had learned enough from his years on this land to know that the right response to something being named correctly is silence and acknowledgement, not elaboration. He helped her down from the wagon. Miguel came out of the barn and introduced himself with the formal courtesy that he always applied to women, removing his hat and holding it at his side. Declan Prout came out of the bunkhouse with feed on his boots and stopped, caught himself, and tried to look presentable. Old Pete Chambers did not come out at all but could be seen through the barn window observing with undisguised curiosity. Tobias showed Josephine to the room he had prepared for her on the 2nd floor, the better of the 2 upstairs rooms, the one with the window facing the creek, the one where the morning light was particularly fine. He had put fresh linens on the bed and had put a jar of wildflowers on the dresser, which he had then removed because it seemed presumptuous, and then replaced because it seemed cold without them. She saw the flowers. She did not comment on them directly. But he saw her register them, and he saw what he interpreted as something quiet and pleased move through her expression. "Supper is at 6, he said. "Miguel cooks on Thursdays. He does it better than I do." "I will be down," she said. He left her to settle and went back downstairs and stood in his own kitchen for a moment feeling remarkably strange, which he recognized as the feeling of something changing in a house that had been unchanged for a very long time. At supper that evening, Miguel made a beef stew with peppers that was considerably better than anything Tobias could produce, and Josephine Alden sat at the table with 3 working men, and spoke to each of them as though they were fully realized people, which they were, though not everyone who sat at that table had always treated them that way. She asked Declan where in Georgia he was from, and listened to his answer with actual attention. She asked Miguel about the cattle operation with specific and intelligent questions that made Tobias realize she had done considerable research about ranching before arriving, and he felt something warm and not entirely expected move through him at the evidence of her preparation. She let old Pete tell a story about a flood in 1874 that destroyed 2 fences without once indicating that she had heard enough, and Pete's story was very long. After supper, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse, Tobias and Josephine sat on the porch with the coffee she had brewed, better coffee than he usually made, which he noticed, and the evening settled around them, warm and faintly buzzing with the sounds of a Texas spring. "You should know," she said, "that I am not a woman who performs contentment. If I am satisfied, you will know it. If I am not, you will also know it, and I expect the same from you." "That seems entirely reasonable," he said. "I have lived 32 years in Cincinnati doing things the way things were expected to be done, and I am finished with that now. I came here because your letters suggested a man who was not interested in performance either. I'm hoping I read that correctly." "You read it correctly," he said. She looked out at the creek, silver under the rising moon, and he looked at the side of her face in the moonlight and thought that she was beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful honestly, without trying. "This is a good place," she said. "I know," he said. "I built it good. I just didn't know what to call it." She looked at him then, a direct and searching look. "I told you what to call it." "You did," he said, "and you were right." They sat there until the moon was properly up, and then she said good night in a matter-of-fact way and went inside. and Tobias Archer sat alone on his porch for the first time in years and felt not that unnamed thing, but something new, something that was its opposite, something that was beginning to take a shape he recognized. The first week passed in the rhythm of the ranch and the careful, unspoken negotiation of two people discovering how to share space without losing themselves in the sharing. Josephine was up before dawn each morning, which Tobias had not expected from a city woman, and she made coffee and set it on the stove and had it ready when he came down. And this was such a simple thing, and yet it altered the texture of his mornings so completely that he found himself looking forward to the stairs in a way he never had before. She asked on the second day if she might ride out with him to see the fuller extent of the property. He saddled a horse for her, a gray mare named Duchess who was calm and well-mannered, and watched with interest as Josephine mounted with a confidence that was not accomplished, but was competent, the confidence of someone who had ridden before and was remembering how rather than learning fresh. They rode the boundary of the southern pasture in the early morning, the light still pink and thin, the cattle moving slowly in the distance, and she asked intelligent questions about grazing rotation and the creek and the disputed property line on the eastern edge that had been a source of friction with a rancher named Harlan Cross for the past 2 years. "What is the nature of the dispute?" she asked. "Harlan says the creek runs through his land past the old cottonwood. I say the cottonwood marks the boundary and the creek east of it is mine. We have been arguing about it since 1880. Is there documentation, a survey? There is a survey from 1869 that is not entirely clear. Courts here move like cold molasses." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the land with those gray-green eyes. "Who holds the survey?" "The county clerk in Millhaven." "Then perhaps it is worth going to Millhaven and reading it with fresh eyes," she said. "Sometimes the person closest to a problem cannot see what someone coming to it new can see." He had not thought of that. He had been living inside the dispute so long that the idea of looking at the document again had become conflated in his mind with the idea of the argument itself. He told her as much. She said, "That is how it is with things we have been carrying too long. They start to feel like they belong to us, even the difficult ones." He looked at her. "That is a very wise thing to say." "I am a school teacher," she said, with a composure that was not without humor. "Wisdom is the professional standard." He laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind, and she looked at him with something that might have been satisfaction, and turned her horse back toward the house, and he followed, and something between them had shifted again, the way ground shifts in a good way, settling rather than sliding. On the fourth day she asked Clara Whitfield to visit, which surprised Tobias, since he had not known Josephine knew Clara Whitfield well enough to invite her. It turned out that Clara had called on Josephine the morning after her arrival, which Tobias had not been informed of, and the two women had apparently taken to each other with the speed that sensible women sometimes do, recognizing a shared quality of straight-talking practical intelligence, and dispensing with the formalities in favor of actual conversation. Clara came and they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked about Redemption Creek and its social landscape and its difficulties. And Tobias, who drifted through the kitchen once and then decided he might as well get a cup of coffee and stay, heard Josephine ask Clara about the schoolhouse. "Is there a teacher at the school currently?" "We have been without one since January," Clara said. "Dorothy Hands got married and her husband took her to Abilene. The children are being taught by whoever can manage on a given day, which is nobody's ideal." Josephine's expression sharpened with interest. "Is the school board willing to hire?" Clara looked at Tobias. Tobias looked at his coffee cup. "I believe they are very willing," Clara said carefully. "I came here to be of use," Josephine said. "Not to be decorative. If there are children who need teaching, that is something I know how to do." "You would have to discuss it with the school board," Tobias said, setting his cup down. "And with me, if you are open to discussing it." She met his gaze steadily. "I am always open to discussion, Mr. Archer. That is the whole point of discussion." Clara looked between them with the expression of a woman watching something become what it is going to be, and she took a sip of her coffee to hide her smile. 2 days later, Josephine rode into town with Tobias to meet the school board, which consisted of the Reverend James Caldwell, a hardware merchant named Foster Drummond, and the mayor, a practical man named William Hart, who ran his office the way he ran his feed store, which was efficiently and without pretension. They interviewed Josephine in the back room of the mayor's office, and Tobias sat in the front room listening to the murmur of voices and trying to read a newspaper without actually reading it. After 30 minutes, the door opened and all four of them came out, and the mayor shook Josephine's hand and said she could start on Monday. The Reverend Caldwell told her that the children of Redemption Creek were in desperate need of proper instruction, and that God's work was being done. Foster Drummond said the pay was not much, but it was honest, and she said honest was what she required. On the walk back to the wagon, Tobias said, "You did not mention you were thinking about the school position." "I mentioned it this morning at breakfast," she said. "You said you were wondering about the school situation." "That is the same thing," she said, in the language of someone who is testing an idea. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite amusement and not quite challenge, but something in between, something that he found he liked very much. "I will need to be in town by 7:30 on school days," she said. "I can ride Duchess." "Duchess is yours to ride," he said. She smiled then, a full smile, the first he had seen that was completely unguarded, and it was the kind of smile that rewrites a face entirely. The features that had seemed composed became warm, and the eyes that had been cataloging became simply alive. And Tobias looked at that smile and felt something he had not felt in many years, and did not want to immediately name in case naming it broke it. The Harlan Cross trouble came to a head in early May, 2 weeks after Josephine's arrival, in the way that festering things always do, faster and louder than anticipated. Harlan Cross was a man of 55 with a disposition that had gone hard in the way that certain men go hard when life has disappointed them too many times, and they have decided, rather than adjusting their expectations, to take the disappointment out on the nearest available target. The nearest available target had been Tobias Archer for 2 years, on the question of the creek boundary. Tobias came home from a fence inspection on a Wednesday afternoon to find Harlan Cross's foreman, a large and unpleasant man named Roy Dibble, sitting on his porch railing uninvited, and Josephine standing in the doorway of the house with the particular stillness of a woman who has assessed a situation and decided that stillness is the correct response. Roy Dibble had apparently arrived while Tobias was out and demanded, on Harlan Cross's behalf, that Tobias acknowledge the creek boundary in Cross's favor or face having the fence torn down. He had made this demand to Josephine, who was the only person present at the time. "What did you say to him?" Tobias asked her, when Roy Dibble had been sent on his way with a message that Tobias would address the matter through appropriate channels. "I told him that property disputes are resolved by documentation and law and not by men sitting uninvited on other people's porches," she said. "And he said that law was a long way from here. And you said?" "I said that inconvenience is not the same as absence." She paused. He did not appear to have a response to that. Tobias looked at her for a moment. "Josephine," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and he heard himself use it with a quality he had not quite intended, something warmer and more certain than his voice usually contained. She registered it. He saw her register it. "Yes," she said. "I am going to Millhaven tomorrow to look at that survey." She nodded. "I will come with you. School is on Fridays." "Saturday, then," she said. "The survey will still be there Saturday." They went on Saturday, rising before full light and driving the 20 miles to Millhaven in the wagon, and the county clerk, a bespectacled man named Arthur Peel, who clearly preferred order to people but tolerated people in service of order, brought out the 1869 survey and spread it on the reading table and stood back while they examined it. Josephine leaned over the document with the focused attention she probably gave to a difficult passage of text, and after a few minutes, she pointed to a notational mark near the cottonwood tree designation that Tobias had been arguing about. "This notation here," she said. "This indicates that the boundary runs to the eastern bank of the creek, not to the midpoint. If the creek runs through your land on the eastern side of the cottonwood, then the entire creek at that point is within your boundary." Arthur Peel adjusted his spectacles and leaned in. After a moment, with the reluctant precision of a man who cannot argue with a document, he said, "She is correct. That notation designates the eastern bank as the boundary marker. The land east of it is registered to the Archer parcel." Tobias looked at the document, and then at Josephine, and he felt an enormous and somewhat ridiculous relief that had as much to do with the 2 years of exhausting argument finally ending, as with the fact that she had found what he had looked at 15 times and never seen. "You found it," he said. "You needed a fresh eye," she said simply, straightening and brushing the wrinkle from her sleeve. "That is all." They had the clerk issue a certified copy of the relevant section of the survey, and Tobias had his attorney in Redemption Creek, a capable man named Silas Rourke, send the documentation to Harlan Cross's attorney. The dispute was resolved within a fortnight. Harlan Cross did not speak to Tobias for months afterward, which Tobias did not find burdensome. What he did find, increasingly, was that the shape of his days had changed in ways that went far beyond the practical resolution of a property dispute or the comfort of better coffee in the mornings. Josephine Alden had settled into the Archer ranch the way a river settles into a new course, without force, without drama, but with a thoroughness that made it impossible to imagine the landscape as it had been before. She brought books and arranged them on the shelf in the sitting room. She planted a kitchen garden in the space behind the house that Tobias had used for nothing. She put curtains in her room and then, after asking his opinion with a directness he found charming, in the kitchen as well. She made changes that were all improvements, and she made them with an instinct for what the house needed that seemed to come from the same place as her naming of it on the first afternoon, a seeing of the thing as it was, and an understanding of what it could be. She was also, he discovered, extremely funny. Not in a performing way, but in the way of a person who notices the absurdity in things and describes it accurately. She told him about her students. There were 14 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 13, with an affection that was also entirely clear-eyed. She told him that young Billy Drummond, the hardware merchant's son, had attempted to explain that the reason he had not completed his assigned reading was that a goat had eaten the relevant pages, and that she had told him she would be very interested to see the goat in question and assess whether it looked literary. "Did he produce the goat?" Tobias asked. "He did not," she said, "but he produced the completed reading the following morning, which was the intended outcome." Tobias laughed, and she looked at him laughing, and they were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table after supper, and in the warm lamplight she looked entirely different from the composed woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, and also completely herself, which was the thing about her that continued to fascinate him. She was the same in every light, only more visible in some. He had been thinking, for the past 3 weeks, with increasing frequency and increasing honesty, about the question of what they were to each other. She had come on an arrangement. He had never used the word courtship in his letter because it had seemed too presumptuous, too laden with implications about feelings he had not yet had and could not have promised. She had come with practical intent, as had he. They had both said, in different ways, that they were not interested in performance or sentiment. But what he felt, sitting across from her in the lamplight, watching her talk about a goat and a child and the matter of a completed assignment, was neither performance nor sentiment. It was something more like recognition, the feeling of a man who has been looking at a word he cannot read for 40 years and has finally been given the key. He did not say any of this that night. He was a careful man, careful in the way that people who have built things alone are careful, because they know what happens when a foundation is rushed. But he was thinking it. In the second week of May, a matter arose that had nothing directly to do with him and everything to do with his understanding of her. One of her students, a girl of 9 named Rosa Vargas, Miguel Vargas's niece, who had come to live with her uncle and aunt after her parents died of fever in San Antonio. The previous winter came to school one morning with bruises on her arm that she explained as a fall, but that Josephine looked at with the eyes of a woman who recognizes what a fall looks like and what other things look like, and they were not the same. Josephine came to Tobias that evening after the other men had gone in. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and she said, plainly and without drama, "I am concerned about Rosa Vargas." He listened to what she had observed. He said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to talk to Miguel," she said, "and I want you to be there because this is his family and he will receive it better from someone he trusts." They talked to Miguel together. Miguel's face went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, pain, denial, and then the hard acceptance of a man who has been not quite looking at something because looking at it required action. Rosa was living with Miguel's brother-in-law, not with Miguel himself, in a house on the edge of town. Miguel drove out that evening with Tobias and came back with Rosa, who thereafter lived in the bunkhouse, not precisely in it, but in the small side room that old Pete had claimed as his own private space, and promptly surrendered with a gruffness that did not entirely conceal the gallantry beneath it. Rosa slept in old Pete's room, and old Pete slept in the bunkhouse proper, and Miguel looked at Tobias the next morning with an expression that combined gratitude with the particular look of a man who is reassessing everything he thought he knew about his employer. Josephine visited with Rosa each evening. She did not make a production of it. She simply sat with the child and talked and sometimes read aloud and made it clear, in the matter-of-fact way she made most things clear, that the child was safe and seen. Tobias watched this and felt something in his chest that was warm and complicated and not entirely unnamed anymore. The incident with Rosa's uncle. It turned out to be the uncle's wife who had administered the bruises, a woman overwhelmed and unhappy, and taking it out on the smallest available person, which is one of the oldest and most inexcusable of human behaviors, was reported to the local law, a sheriff named Ben Rawlings, who was a decent man, and handled it with the seriousness it deserved. Rosa remained at the Archer Ranch, and within 2 weeks she had formed a particular attachment to old Pete, who claimed not to enjoy it and obviously did, and to Duchess the Gray Mare, and to Josephine, whom she followed around the kitchen garden on Saturday mornings with the industry of a child who has decided that work is safety. It was Rosa, actually, who named what was happening between Tobias and Josephine. She said it the way children say things, directly, without the particular filter that adults develop to protect themselves from accuracy. She said it on a Saturday morning in the garden in a conversation that Tobias was overhearing from the porch without, he told himself, eavesdropping. "Are you going to marry Mr. Archer?" Rosa asked, Josephine's voice slightly muffled by distance. "That is a very particular question." "Miguel says you came here so he would ask you," Rosa said. "Did Miguel say that?" "He said it to Declan. I heard them." A pause, then, "What do you think about it, about me being here?" Rosa's answer, after a moment's serious consideration, "I think it is better. The house was like a question before. Now it is more like an answer." Tobias sat very still on the porch. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at the creek. He thought, a 9-year-old girl has just described with complete precision what has happened to the Archer Ranch in the past month. He went inside. He went to his desk and he sat there for a while with a blank page in front of him, and he did not write anything on the page, but he organized his thoughts the way he organized his fences, clearly, directly, with the understanding that a thing built properly will hold. He went back out. Josephine was coming in from the garden, Rosa trailing behind her with a basket of early radishes. Tobias said, "Miss Alden, Could I speak with you this afternoon? She looked at him and her gray-green eyes did that thing they always did, that careful, uncategorizing look. Of course, she said. Rosa went to find old Pete. Tobias and Josephine walked down to the creek in the warm Saturday afternoon, the water running low and clear over the red stones, the cottonwood putting out its first green. They walked a little way along the bank and then they stopped and he turned to face her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I wrote to that agency because Clara Whitfield wore me down, and because there was something about my evenings that was not right, and I could not put a name to it. I was not expecting the letters you wrote. I was not expecting someone who said real that many times with that many meanings. I was not expecting someone who would come here and name the thing I had spent 40 years building in her first 10 minutes. She was very still, listening. "I am 40 years old," he said. "I have spent 20 of those years on this land, and I know it the way I know my own hands, but what I have discovered in the past month is that I did not know what it was for. I thought I knew, I thought it was for itself, the way work is sometimes for itself, but it turns out it was for something I had not yet arrived at." "Tobias," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and it came out of her mouth with the same quality as his use of hers, that warmth and certainty that precedes something important. "I would like to ask you to stay," he said. "Not on the arrangement we came with, which was, I am not sure what it was exactly, something practical and careful. I would like to ask you to stay in a different way. I would like to ask you to stay as my wife, if that is something you are willing to consider. And I want to be honest with you, the way you were honest with me in your letters, so I will tell you that it is not an arrangement I am proposing anymore. I think it stopped being an arrangement somewhere around the third morning you had coffee ready when I came downstairs." She looked at him for a long moment, that thorough, unhurried look, and he thought he saw something behind her eyes that was moving through the careful part and into the real part, the part she reserved, the way she reserved the warmth in her voice. "I came here on a practical basis," she said. "That is true. I told myself that I was a practical woman and that the West was a practical place, and that a sensible arrangement between two sensible adults was a respectable way to construct a life." She paused. "I told myself that in Cincinnati, on the stagecoach through Kansas, some of the way through Texas. And then," he said, "and then I saw this place in the evening light and I knew what it was, and I looked at you on the porch trying to pretend you had not ridden fast to get there, and I thought, oh," she said the last word softly, "I thought this is going to be more than practical." He reached out and took her hand, which he had not done before, and her hand in his was warm and certain and did not hesitate. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It is a yes," she said. "And it is an honest yes, which I think you know is the only kind I am capable of." He looked at her in the afternoon sun by the creek, and she looked back at him without the catalogue behind her eyes now, with something open and warm and real. That word, her word, always her word. And he thought that he was looking at the answer to the question he had not known he had been asking for 40 years. He kissed her, which was a somewhat tentative thing the first time and then less tentative. And the creek ran past them, and the cottonwood moved in the light warm breeze, and somewhere back at the house old Pete could be heard telling Rosa that if she fed that mare too many carrots the mare would get ideas. They married in the first week of June, in the small white church in Redemption Creek, the Reverend Caldwell presiding with evident satisfaction. Clara Whitfield cried, which she denied vigorously. Earl Whitfield patted Tobias on the arm and said, "About time," and Tobias did not disagree. Miguel Vargas stood as witness with the grave dignity he brought to everything important. Declan Prout wore a clean shirt for only the second time Tobias could recall. Old Pete Chambers sat in the front pew beside Rosa Vargas, and when Josephine came down the short aisle in a dress of deep blue that she had sewn herself practical even in ceremony, Rosa took Pete's rough hand in her small one, and Pete allowed it. Josephine carried a small bouquet of wildflowers from the kitchen garden because she said she did not need cut flowers from a city. She had her own, and Tobias stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and thought that he had spent 40 years not knowing what he was building, and she had known it the moment she arrived, and he was ready, entirely and finally ready, to live in the thing she had named. Reverend Caldwell spoke about commitment and honesty, and the particular difficulty and grace of building a life with another person. He spoke about the West as a place where the usual supports were absent, and what remained was character, which he said was not a small thing, and Tobias agreed with him. When he slid the ring onto Josephine's finger, a plain gold band that he had bought from the jeweler in Millhaven, who had offered something more ornate, and whom Josephine had overridden with calm certainty on her visit to the shop 2 weeks before, she looked at him with those eyes and she said, quietly, before the Reverend got to the formal part, "You know you are completely stuck with me now." "I am aware," he said. "I am fine with that." The reception was at the Whitfield Ranch, because Clara had insisted and Josephine had accepted with good grace, and there was food and music and dancing in the late afternoon warmth, and Tobias danced with Josephine 3 times and was not, he would say later, a gifted dancer, but she said he was better than he thought, and he chose to believe her, which he was discovering was a reasonable policy where Josephine was concerned. Harlan Cross did not attend the wedding. Nobody commented on this absence. The summer settled over the Archer ranch like something earned. Josephine taught school through June and then had July and August free, as the school calendar demanded, and she spent those months in the garden and on the porch with books, and sometimes out riding Duchess in the early mornings with Tobias, the two of them covering the pasture in the soft light, talking about the cattle and about her students and about things that had nothing to do with either, about what she had read and what he thought about it, about places she had been and places she had not, about the kind of people they had been before they were the people they were now. She told him about her mother's illness, which had been long and had taken everything years of Josephine's 20s, the opportunity for other choices, the leisure to discover what she wanted before necessity decided for her. She told him without self-pity, with the plain directness she brought to everything, but he heard the weight of it and he understood, for the first time clearly, what she had meant in that first letter when she said she had no remaining attachment to Cincinnati. It was not that the city had failed her. It was that she had spent everything she had there, and what remained needed to find a new place. He told her about the first winter on this land, when he was 20 years old and had nothing but the mule and the seed catalog, and the conviction that stubbornness was a sufficient substitute for wisdom, and the first 3 weeks of January had done their best to prove him wrong. He told her about the creek freezing for the first time and thinking it was a personal insult. He told her about the night in 1865 when news of the end of the war came through, and he had sat alone in his half-built barn and thought about the years that had passed while he was here, and the country had been tearing itself apart out there, and the complicated feelings of a man who had built something during something terrible and did not entirely know what that made him. She listened to all of this the way she listened to everything completely, without hurry, without needing to fill the silences with reassurance. And then she said about the last thing, "I think it makes you a man who knew that something had to be built and built it, and the fact that something terrible was happening elsewhere does not negate the building. People kept planting during every terrible thing that has ever happened. That is not indifference. That is the long argument for continuity." He looked at her for a long time. "Where did you come from?" he said, and it was not a question about Cincinnati. She understood it was not a question about Cincinnati. "I came from the same place you did," she said, "a long way of being practical and careful and getting through things, and then here." "And then here," he agreed. He stopped his horse. She stopped hers. The morning light was full on the eastern pasture, the cattle moving in the gold-green grass, the creek line a dark stripe of cottonwood to the south, and he leaned across from his saddle and kissed her in the middle of all that open land, and she kissed him back, and it was the easiest and most complete thing, the way things are when they are right. In August, Old Pete came to Tobias with a request. He was 61 years old, he said, which was not particularly old, but his joints did not share his opinion, and he was wondering whether Tobias would consider a modification of his duties that kept him closer to the house and the barn rather than the open pasture. He said this with the difficulty of a proud man requesting something he thinks might be refused, and Tobias said, before he finished, that of course he would modify it, and that Pete could take on the management of the barn and the equipment and the kitchen garden, which had expanded considerably under Josephine's direction, and that this was not a demotion but a different post, and one that needed doing. Pete left the kitchen with his dignity intact, and Tobias heard him in the garden 20 minutes later talking to Rosa about the onion situation with the authority of a man in charge of something real. Josephine came in from the sitting room where she had been reading and said, "You did that very well. You were listening." "I was reading," she said. "The door is thin." She paused. It was still very well done. He discovered, as the summer wore on, that she was right about nearly everything, not in an infuriating way, but in the way of someone who simply has good judgment and is willing to apply it consistently. She was right about the garden layout, and she was right about the window shutter that needed replacing, and she was right about Miguel's suggestion to bring in a second bull for the fall breeding program, which she had discussed with Miguel directly and then mentioned at supper as a reasonable idea, and which Tobias had implemented, and which had improved the breeding season considerably. She was wrong about one thing. She was wrong about the weather. She said in mid-August that the summer felt like it was breaking early, and it was not breaking early. It was building toward a late storm that rolled in from the southwest in the last week of August with the kind of force that the Texas weather is capable of when it has been holding back. It was not the worst storm he had seen on this land, but it was significant high winds, rain, lightning that walked across the ridge to the north like something angry. He was in the barn with Miguel and Declan securing the animals when he realized Josephine was not in the house, which he knew because he had checked at the height of the storm when the wind had driven him to the kitchen door, and she was not there. He found her, after a frantic few minutes, in the cellar of the barn, with Rosa, who had apparently gone to the barn to check on Duchess at the beginning of the storm and been caught by the worst of it before she could get back. Josephine had gone after her and found her in the barn and brought her to the cellar, which was the safest structure on the property, and they were sitting on a feed sack with a lantern, Rosa pressed against Josephine's side with the same absolute trust she gave to old Pete, and Josephine with her arm around the child, reading aloud from a small book she had brought from somewhere, a book of fables, of all things, by the light of the lantern, while the storm beat the boards above them. He came in soaked to the skin through the cellar hatch, and Josephine looked up at him and said, "We are quite all right." "I can see that," he said, and he sat down on the floor of the cellar and listened to her read the rest of the fable, and Rosa fell asleep against Josephine's shoulder before it was finished, and Josephine finished it anyway, quietly, and then looked at him across the sleeping child with a look that said everything it needed to without a word. The storm broke, and they carried Rosa to the house and put her in her room, which was now properly her room, with her things in it, and Tobias said to Josephine, while she wrung the rain out of her hair, "You went out in that storm for her." "She is a child in my care," Josephine said, as though the matter were entirely obvious and required no explanation. He stood in the kitchen looking at her with an expression he did not try to moderate. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. I am glad you are here." She looked at him for a moment, and then she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which she did not often initiate with that directness, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the kitchen in the aftermath of the storm, wet and relieved and entirely at home. In October of that year, Josephine told him that she was going to have a child. She told him in the evening, on the porch in the hour after supper, and she told him with the same directness she brought to everything, simply looking at him, without the decorating that the announcement might have received from another kind of woman. She said, "I am going to have a child, sometime around April, I believe, by my reckoning." He was quiet for a moment that was not a short moment. He was aware of a feeling moving through him that was composed of several things at once: a warmth, a fear that was not exactly fear but the particular vertigo of something enormous, a gratitude so specific and profound that he did not have immediate language for it. "Are you well?" he said. It was the first thing he found to say, and not the most adequate thing, but it was the most urgent one. "I am entirely well," she said. "I was not unwell this morning in any significant way, if that is your concern." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. He held it for a moment, looking at it, her hand in his, as he had held it that day at the creek when he asked her to stay. "I did not build that house with this in mind," he said. "I did not build anything here with this in mind, but I find that the house suddenly makes considerably more sense." She looked at him, and her gray-green eyes were very soft in the evening light, softer than he saw them often. "Everything always makes sense afterward," she said. "That is the nature of things. You do not know what you are building until it is built. And then someone comes along and names it," he said. "Sometimes," she said. "Yes." He pressed her hand. She pressed back. The autumn deepened, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms. And Josephine continued teaching until December, when the cold made the ride into town genuinely unpleasant, and she agreed, after some convincing that was not as much convincing as she let on, to accept that Mrs. Foster Drummond would substitute until the new year. She stayed close to the house through January and February, not by compulsion but by what appeared to be a genuine contentment. She read more than she usually did. She and Rosa developed an elaborate routine of kitchen experiments on Sunday afternoons, and she and Tobias spent the long winter evenings in the sitting room with the fire going, talking about everything and nothing, playing cards badly, reading companionably in the same room, and Tobias thought, not for the first time, that this was what the sitting room had been for all along. Old Pete, who had not mentioned Rosa's future status at any point, came to Tobias in February with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a carefully prepared speech, and he said that he was wondering, since Rosa had been at the ranch for 8 months and showed no signs of going anywhere and clearly belonged here, whether Tobias had given thought to making that official in some legal sense. Tobias said that Josephine and he had discussed it. Pete said he was glad to hear it. Tobias said they were planning to speak to Sela's work about the legal aspects in the spring. Pete nodded and left. He did not say anything more about it, but that evening at supper he told Rosa, while passing the bread, that she would need to learn to do her fractions properly, because a person living at a working ranch needed to understand numbers. And Rosa said she already knew her fractions, and Pete said then she could teach him, and Rosa laughed. And it was the best thing that had happened in that kitchen in a very long time. And Josephine looked at Tobias across the table, and he looked back at her, and the look between them said, "This is the thing. This here, this exact moment, this is what it was all for." March came in with the first real warmth, and Josephine returned to teaching, riding Duchess into town each morning, growing and magnificent and completely unconcerned about the growing, which was her way. She met the new shape of herself with the same practical acceptance she met everything. Her students apparently had no idea how to respond to a teacher who was expecting a child and continued to teach with complete authority, and their confusion settled eventually into the respect that she had always commanded from them, because the authority had not changed, only the outline. Sela's work drew up the papers regarding Rosa's guardianship, and Miguel Vargas, as her closest blood relation, signed the documents confirming that the Archers would serve as Rosa's legal guardians, which he did with his hat in his hands and an expression that was full of a dignity that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with love. He was giving her the better thing, and he knew it, and it cost him something, and he did it anyway. Rosa was told. She accepted it with the gravity of a child who has been through enough to understand that good news is not always simple, but also with a deep relief that was visible in the loosening of something she had been holding since long before she came to the ranch. She asked Josephine that evening whether she should call her something different. Josephine said, "You call me what feels right to you. There is no wrong answer." Rosa thought about it for a full week. She came to Josephine on a Saturday morning in the garden and said, "I think I will call you Josie." Nobody else called her Josie. Tobias noticed this and understood it and said nothing, which was correct. Rosa then went to find Pete to tell him about the fractions she had learned, and Josephine went on planting and Tobias stood on the porch watching the morning and felt the completeness of it the way you feel the completion of a long structure, not with triumph, because the work is not triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of something made well. April came, and with it the child. It was a long labor, as first labors often are, and Clara Whitfield came and stayed through it all, and Dr. Albert Morse rode out from town and was there when the child arrived, which was a good thing, and Miguel and Declan and old Pete and Rosa all stood outside the house in the April morning, not knowing what to do with themselves, doing nothing with themselves with the particular communal anxiety of people who care very much about what is happening inside a house they cannot enter. Old Pete told Rosa 3 times that everything was fine. Rosa told Pete she knew that. They stood together by the barn door and waited. The child was a boy. He came into the world in the early morning with a great deal of vehement opinion about the transition, which Dr. Morse said was a very good sign. He was healthy and loud, and entirely convinced that the world owed him immediate attention, which it paid. Tobias held him with the careful terror of a man holding something irreplaceable, and the boy looked up at him from a face that was still working out what a face was supposed to do, and Tobias felt something break open in his chest, and something new come through the opening, something with no name at all yet except, he thought, the beginning of one. Josephine lay in the morning light with the exhaustion of someone who has done something enormous and the satisfaction of someone who has done it well. "Look at him," she said. "I see him," Tobias said. "What do you think?" He looked at his son, who was considering his own fist with the intensity of a scholar encountering a new text. "I think he has your eyes," he said. "He has your chin," she said. "He is going to be difficult," Tobias said, "if he has both our tendencies." "He is going to be wonderful," Josephine said with certainty. Rosa was allowed in, and she stood beside the bed and looked at the baby with an expression that went through several complicated negotiations before settling on something that was partly the sovereignty of a child who has been sole in her position, and partly the beginning of something that would, in time, become the fierce protective love of an older sister. Pete looked in through the doorway and declined to come closer, but said, gruffly, from the threshold, "That is a fine-looking child," which for Pete was the equivalent of a declaration. They named the boy Samuel James Archer. Samuel for no particular person, because they both agreed a child should have his own name and not be carrying the weight of someone else's. James after Tobias's father, who had died when Tobias was 14 and who had been a man of few words and many works, and who would have recognized, Tobias thought, the ranch and what it contained, and approved of all of it. In the weeks after Samuel's arrival, the Archer ranch settled into a new and richer pattern. Josephine nursed the baby and managed the household, and gradually resumed a shorter version of her school duties in June, arriving later and leaving earlier than she had, with Clara Whitfield volunteering as morning supervisor until she arrived. Samuel came with her some days, in a basket that she set at the front of the classroom, and her students treated the baby with the awed reverence of children, in the presence of something that has not yet learned to be complicated. Tobias found that his days now had an architecture they had not previously possessed. He had always worked from purpose. The cattle required tending, the fences required inspection, the accounts required attention, but the purpose had been the work itself. Now the work pointed towards something. He rode the southern pasture and he thought about Samuel seeing this land eventually. He drove the fence posts and thought about the fence lasting after him. He looked at the creek and thought about what he would tell his son about it, about the boundary dispute and the survey, and the woman who had found in a document what 40 years of looking had not yielded, because she came to it fresh. He tried to explain this to Josephine one evening, the change in the texture of the purpose, and she listened with her full attention and then said, "You have always been building for the future. You just did not have specific faces to put to it. Now you do. Samuel's face," he said, "and Rosa's," she said, "and mine." He looked at her across the sitting room, her with a book on her knee and the lamplight on her hair and the sound of Samuel sleeping above them in the room they had made into his, and Rosa's voice audible through the ceiling as she talked to herself in the way she did when she was reading aloud to practice, and he thought that the room he had been sitting in for 20 years had been waiting for exactly this noise. "Josephine," he said. She looked up from the book. "Yes, I love you," he said. He said it the way he did everything without decoration, directly, meaning it with everything he had. "I should have said it before. I am saying it now." She looked at him for a moment, and her gray-green eyes did not catalogue or assess but simply looked at him openly, the way he had first seen them go open that day at the creek when he asked her to stay. "I love you," she said. "I have for some time. I was waiting to see when you would find it." "I found it when you stepped off the stagecoach," he said. "I just did not know yet what it was." "You are a slow namer," she said, and there was warmth in it, rich and certain. "That is all right. You build well. The naming is secondary." He crossed the room and sat beside her, and she put the book down, and he took her hand and they sat together in the lamplight, while the house breathed around them. The house that was a home, that she had named on a Thursday afternoon in April 1882 from a wagon bench in the last light of the day. A home that had taken 40 years of solitary construction to complete and 5 minutes of her presence to understand. The summer of 1883 brought heat and good rains, and a cattle sale in August that was the best Tobias had achieved in 5 years. And he and Miguel rode to Millhaven for the market, with a feeling of genuine satisfaction that was different from previous years. Because Josephine had gone over the accounts with him the week before and identified 3 efficiencies he had not seen, and the sale reflected them. He came home with better numbers and told her so, and she said the credit was entirely his because he had built the operation, and he said the credit was half hers at minimum because she had read the accounts, and she said they could split it, and he said that was acceptable. Harlan Cross, it emerged in August, had sold his operation and left the territory, which was news that arrived through Earl Whitfield with an air of satisfaction that Tobias tried not to share too obviously. Cross had apparently not recovered from the loss of the boundary dispute and had other difficulties besides, and the land went to a family from Kansas named Peterson, a husband and wife and 4 children, who called on the Archers in September, and whom Josephine received on the porch with coffee and such natural hospitality that within 20 minutes they were all seated and talking like neighbors of long standing. The Petersons had 3 boys and a girl, the oldest boy being 12 and the girl being 10, and Rosa eyed the 10-year-old girl across the porch with the careful measurement of a child deciding whether someone is worth knowing, and the girl eyed Rosa back with equal care. And by the time their parents had finished their coffee, the 2 of them were in the kitchen garden, which Rosa was showing with the proprietary authority of someone very comfortable on this land, and Tobias looked at that and thought, yes, this is what land is for finally, not just the fences and the water rights and the breeding seasons, but this children in a garden learning the names of things. In the fall of 1883, Tobias went with Josephine to Millhaven, to the same county clerk's office where they had gone to read the survey 2 years before, and they completed the formal legal adoption of Rosa Vargas Archer, which was what she was called afterward, and which she received with a quiet and absolute gravity, signing her name in the clerk's register with the careful deliberateness of a child who understands that some things, once written, are permanent, and who approves of that permanence? Arthur Peel, the bespectacled clerk, said, "Congratulations are in order." Rosa said, "Thank you," with the composure of someone who has learned from a particular schoolteacher how to receive acknowledgement without being undone by it. On the drive back from Millhaven, Rosa sat in the wagon bed and watched the Texas landscape going by with an expression that was, for the first time since Tobias had known her, entirely unguarded. No watchfulness, no held breath, just a child looking at the land she belonged to. That winter was mild, and Christmas at the Archer Ranch was a thing that Tobias had never previously celebrated with anything approaching ceremony. He had observed the day, but without the architecture that it requires to feel like itself. Josephine gave it that architecture. She made the house smell of pine and baked things, and she put candles in the windows, and invited the Whitfields and Miguel and Declan, and a few families from town whom she knew through school, and the house filled with people and noise, and the particular warmth of a large gathering in a well-built space. And Tobias moved through it all and knew, with a certainty that left no room for the old unnameable feeling, that this was the fullness the thing had always been intended for. Samuel sat in Josephine's arms for much of the evening, wide-eyed at the number of people, and then fell asleep against her shoulder while the room went on around him. Rosa sat beside old Pete and ate more than was strictly necessary, and listened to a long and improbable story from Earl Whitfield about a coyote and a fence post that had the whole table in varying states of laughter, and Tobias sat at the head of his table and looked at every person in the room and thought, "I have been building this for 40 years, and I did not know what it was until she walked in and told me." He caught Josephine's eye across the table. She was talking to Clara Whitfield, but she saw him looking, and she held his look for a moment with those gray-green eyes and a small, private smile that was only for him, the kind of smile that belongs to two people who have built something together and know what it is. He smiled back. It was not a small smile. Spring came again, the second spring since Josephine had arrived, and with it the anniversary of their meeting, or close to it. And Tobias marked the occasion by saddling both horses early in the morning without telling her why and asking her to ride with him, which she did, trusting him without requiring explanation, which was something he had noticed about her and valued more than he could easily say. He rode her to the ridge that overlooked the fullest view of the ranch, the house and the barn and the outbuildings arranged below, the creek running, the cattle spread across the south pasture, the kitchen garden with its early plantings, the smoke beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney where old Pete was starting the morning coffee, a thin line of light domestic smoke against the wide Texas sky. He stopped, and they sat on their horses side by side and looked at it. 600 acres, she said. 620 now, he said. I bought the small parcel on the north side in January. I know, she said. I helped you with the accounting. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was in the morning light as she had been in every light he had ever seen her in, entirely herself, unhurried, seeing the thing in front of her accurately and without diminishment. You know what I want to tell you, he said. Tell me anyway, she said. I like hearing you try to say things. Try, he said with affection. You never try badly, she said. You always get there. I just like watching you arrive. He looked at the ranch below them and then back at her. I built all of that, he said, without knowing what I was building. I built it for 20 years before you came, and in those 20 years I never once sat up on this ridge and thought, this is complete. I thought it was always one more season away from being what it was supposed to be. And now, she said, now it is what it is supposed to be, he said. Now it has a name, it is a home, you named it. I just needed I just needed you to see it clearly enough to say it. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice had that quality it had sometimes, the warmth carried fully forward without reserve. You built the thing, she said. I only identified it. That is not nothing, but neither is it the building. You did the building, Tobias, every post and every plank and every year of it. I walked in and recognized what you had made. The making was yours. He thought about that. He thought about 20 years of solitary work and the long evenings on the porch with the cooling coffee and the unnameable quality of the thing he had constructed. "I think we are both right," he said. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she said, with that tilt of her voice toward humor, and he laughed, the real laugh, the one she had been the first in a long time to bring out of him. They rode back down to the ranch. Old Pete had coffee ready and said nothing about where they had been but handed them each a cup with the competence of a man who has decided his purpose in life is useful and is fulfilling it. And Rosa came down the stairs with Samuel balanced somewhat precariously against her hip, the baby heavy and cheerful and reaching for her braid. "He was awake," Rosa said to Josephine. "I went to him." "Thank you," Josephine said, taking Samuel, who made a grab for her face with the enthusiasm of a person who has recently discovered faces. "He said something," Rosa said. Both Tobias and Josephine looked at Rosa. "He said a sound," Rosa clarified, "that I think was my name. It was close to my name." "That is his first word," Tobias said. "Approximately," Rosa said with dignity. Josephine looked at the baby. "Did you say Rosa's name?" she asked him in the tone that people use with small children, knowing they will not get an answer and asking anyway. Samuel said nothing useful but looked enormously pleased about something. "Close enough," Pete said from the stove, which was his contribution to the subject, and that was final enough for everyone. The months that followed were full in the way that a good life is full, not with the packed busyness of a life running from itself, but with the accumulating richness of a life lived at the right pace in the right place. Declan Prout, who had been learning fast for 3 years, took on more responsibility without being asked to, which was the sign of a man becoming what he was meant to be. And Tobias gave him a raise in October that Declan received with more composure than he had received anything else in the 3 years Tobias had known him, which meant he was growing up. Miguel Vargas turned 45 in September, and Josephine organized a supper in his honor that he pretended to find unnecessary and clearly found moving. He told her afterward, with the formal and genuine courtesy that was his particular way, that the ranch was a different place than it had been, and that he meant that as the highest possible compliment. She thanked him in the same spirit. Rosa started teaching Samuel to walk in the November of his first birthday, which consisted primarily of Rosa walking backward across the kitchen floor with her hands held out, while Samuel clutched 2 of her fingers and regarded the floor with suspicion and occasional triumph. Old Pete supervised from his chair by the window and offered running commentary on Samuel's technique that was entirely unsolicited and entirely useful, because Pete had an eye for what needed adjusting, and Samuel, who understood nothing Pete said, seemed to respond to the tone of it and tried harder. His first real steps were across the kitchen floor in November with Rosa's hands just out of reach and Pete watching, and Tobias and Josephine standing in the doorway where they had come in from outside without either Rosa or Pete noticing. And Samuel crossed 3 full feet of kitchen floor under his own power and sat down with a thump and looked around for acknowledgement of what he had done, which he received immediately and abundantly from everyone. Josephine pressed her hand over her mouth, not to stifle emotion but to contain it, and Tobias put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they watched their son be celebrated by the people who loved him. In the kitchen of the house she had named a home, on the ranch he had built without knowing what he was building, and everything that had ever been incomplete was complete. In the spring of 1885, Josephine told him about the second child, which she did in the same direct way as the first, matter of fact, seated on the porch in the hour after supper. She had stopped hedging anything by this point. She simply said what was true and let it be true. "November, I think," she said. He took her hand in the same way he always did. He held it. "Rosa will be thrilled," he said. "Rosa will be the most qualified person in this house to have an opinion about it," Josephine said, "and she will not hesitate to express that opinion. That is because she learned from her mother," he said. The word fell between them, mother, and Josephine looked at him with something in her eyes that was not the cataloging look, and not the assessment, and not the warm humor she had used for 3 years to navigate the space between them. It was something simpler and more fundamental, something that did not need a name because it was its own name. "Yes," she said, "I suppose she did." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was not something he usually did. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, though she had changed that nature in him somewhat, and she looked at him doing it, and her eyes did that thing they had done on the creek bank 2 years ago, that complete openness. The second child was born in November, as she had estimated, and it was a girl this time, small and certain in the way that some people are certain from the very first moment of their existence. She had Josephine's directness already in her face, or so Tobias said, and Josephine said that was wishful thinking in a newborn, and he said he knew what he saw. They named her Clara, after Clara Whitfield, who received the news with such feeling that she had to sit down, which was not something Clara Whitfield typically needed to do. The Archer Ranch in the winter of 1885 contained 620 acres of working land, a cattle operation that was one of the better run in that part of Texas, a kitchen garden that had expanded to a full acre, 3 permanent ranch hands, 1 aging man who was somewhere between staff and family, 1 adopted daughter who was becoming herself in the particular way of children who have been given the conditions to become themselves, 1 son who was walking and talking and had opinions about his food, 1 newborn daughter who had opinions about everything, and 2 people who had built something together without quite knowing, in the beginning, that they were building together. Josephine sat in the rocking chair by the fire on a December evening, Clara on her knee, Samuel at her feet with a wooden horse that Tobias had carved for him, not well, but recognizably, and Rosa at the table doing her schoolwork by the lamp, and Tobias in his chair across from her with the ranch accounts open but not being attended to, because what was happening in the room was more interesting than the accounts. He looked at her. She was looking at Clara, at the small certain face of this new person, and she was talking softly to the baby about nothing in particular, about the fire and the evening and the fact that tomorrow would be cold, but the day after that might be warmer, the way people talk to babies, telling them about the world they have arrived in as though the narration itself is a kind of welcome. She looked up and found him looking. She raised an eyebrow in the mild challenge of a woman very comfortable in her life. "The accounts," she said, "they will still be accounts tomorrow," he said. "They will not balance themselves." "No," he agreed, "they will not." He closed the accounts book and set it aside, and she returned to talking to Clara about the weather, and Rosa moved her lamp slightly to better illuminate the page she was working on, and Samuel fell asleep against the leg of Tobias's chair with the wooden horse clutched in one hand. And the fire went on burning, and the Texas night went on outside the window, and the house went on being what it was, what she had named it, what it had always been building toward, quietly, without drama, with the long, steady patience of something being built by the right person for the right reason. Tobias Archer, who had come to this land at 20 years old with a mule and a seed catalog, and 40 years of solitary work ahead of him, who had built fences and barns and a house and a cattle operation without once being able to name what he was building, who had sat alone on his porch with cold coffee for more evenings than he could count and felt the unnamed quality of everything around him, and thought it was simply the nature of his life, sat in his chair by the fire with his family around him, and felt none of that. He felt, instead, the exact and precise word for the thing: home. Josephine had given it to him from a wagon bench on a Thursday afternoon in April, in the last light of the day, before she even came inside. She had seen it for what it was before he helped her down from the wagon, before supper, before the letters became real people, before any of it. She had walked in and named it, and the naming had been the beginning of his understanding, and the understanding had grown into this: into the fire and the children and the woman in the rocking chair who was the most honest person he had ever known, and the love he had not known to look for, and the life that had been, it turned out, entirely worth all 40 years of building. He thought about saying this. He thought about the long road of saying things, how he had been a slow namer, how she had told him so with that warmth in her voice, how she had said she liked watching him arrive. He arrived. "Josephine," he said. She looked up from Clara. "Thank you," he said, "for naming it." She looked at him across the fire and she smiled, the full smile, the one that rewrote her face, the one he had first seen outside the Redemption Creek mayor's office when she had gotten the teaching position and had not bothered to moderate her satisfaction. The best smile he had ever seen, and the one that belonged to this house and this life and to him. "You built it," she said. "I just said what it was." "That is everything," he said. "That is the whole thing." She held his gaze for a moment, those gray-green eyes, those eyes that had catalogued him on a Thursday afternoon and found him worth knowing, found him worth naming, found him worth crossing a country for, and then she looked back at Clara, and the fire went on, and the night went on, and the Archer Ranch held everything it was always meant to hold. Complete. Named. Home.